Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our session today, Plenary with Panel, Asia's Journey to Prosperity. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mr. Yasuyuki Sawada, to open the session. Mr. Yasuyuki Sawada, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to International Economic Association World Congress Plenary Session, Asia's Journey to Prosperity. I'm Yasu Sawada, Chief Economist and Director General of Asian Development Bank ADB, and I will moderate discussion today. In Asia, renewed COVID-19 outbreaks show the pandemic is indeed far from beaten, and vaccination plans are still in early stages. While we envision developing Asia's growth will rebound to 7.3% this year 2021, recovery paths in Asia quite diverge. As export boosts the growth in some economies, but containment and travel restrictions restrain the growth in other countries and economies. Seeing the phenomenal economic progress in Asia, a critical question now is whether the crisis will leave permanent scars in the region, whether Asia's journey to prosperity can be continued. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce very distinguished experts to discuss this critical issue. Mr. Kaushik Basu of Cornell University and President of IEA, Mr. Suahasil Nazara, Vice Minister of Finance, Government of Indonesia, Mr. Chatib Basri of University of Indonesia, a former Minister of Finance of Indonesia and currently a Chairman of PT Bank Mandiri Tbk and Chairman of the PTXL Axiata. Mr. Takehiko Nakao, a former President of Asian Development Bank and Chairman of Institute at MIS for Research and Technology. Thank you very much for all distinguished panelists for joining the plenary session today. Indeed, as you can see, we have somewhat gender imbalance of today's panel, unfortunately, because of the last minute rearrangement of panelists. But our intention was to have a gender balance, but unfortunately, because of the unexpected rearrangement, we have some all the panelists are male, unfortunately. Before handing over microphones to the panelists, let me spend 10 minutes or so to set out stage by summarizing the book Asia's ADB published last year, entitled Asia's Journey to Prosperity. Asia's Journey to Prosperity, Policy, Market, and Technology over the 50 years. This is more than 500 pages, very thick book, came out of a 3-year long study under the leadership of former President of ADB, Nakao. This book involved ADB staff from various departments and offices. A little bit background, ADB was established in year 1966. In the 1960s, Asia was very poor, and feeding a large and growing population was one of the critical challenges. There was a pessimism about Asia's prospect for industrialization and broader development, as described in a very famous book by Gunnar Myrdal titled Asian Drama. Half a century on, Asia has emerged as a center of global dynamism. What can we explain Asia's economic success in the past 50 years? This book tried to attempts to answer this question. There are many studies on Asian development. One of the well-known study is World Bank's East Asian Miracle Policy Report, published in 1993. This ADB book differs from the World Bank report and other publication in 3 aspects. Number 1, this ADB book covers a much wider range of countries and economies, including China, Central Asia, as well as the Pacific region. Number 2, ADB book covers a much longer time period. And number 3, the book discusses much wider topics. So let me share with you briefly a table of contents. So this is a table of contents of ADB book. We tried to uncover elements of phenomenal growth in Asia Pacific by these listed 15 chapters. ranging from structural transformation, technology, education, gender, macro stability to regional cooperation and integration. The highlighted chapters are quite unique among other, if we compare other publications analyzing Asia's development performance, especially gender chapter and the climate change chapter. We believe this is quite unique to endorse 5 decades of Asian performance. And the day before yesterday, July 1st, we published presentation and lecture slides of these 15 chapters. So this book can be used for teaching in Asian development or subtext book for development economics, for example. And also we released 2 days ago a supplemental chapter to this book titled Disaster Resilience in Asia, because the original book didn't cover disaster. So now I'd like to highlight a few important points of a discussion in this book. Between 1960 and 2018, developing Asia's average annual per capita GDP growth reached 4.7%, the fastest among the different regions. As a result, a share of developing Asia out of a global GDP in 1960, it was only 4%, but dramatically increased to 24% just before COVID-19. Including, if we include Japan, Australia, New Zealand to developing Asia, the share, Asia as a global share in terms of GDP, used to be 13% in 1960s, but now 1/3, 34%. Rapid growth also led to a dramatic improvement in broad development indicators in Asia. Rate of extreme poverty, as you can see from the right end, declined from 68% in year 1980 down to 7% in year 2015, with more than 1 billion people escaping out of extreme poverty. Life expectancy at birth rose, infant mortality rate dramatically dropped, and mean years of schooling increased substantially. So what's the key driver of Asia's phenomenal growth? One important driver is to promote the structural transformation. This is a key driver. And this is, we observe structural transformation as a key driver across the world, whether developed country or current developing economies. But Asia has achieved this stylized structural transformation at a much faster speed. Structural transformation also involves a shift of resources from low productivity production to high production activities in each of the 3 sectors through technological progress. And actually, we have done comprehensive growth decomposition. You can see from the right end. 1970s and 1980s, Asia's growth was driven mainly by mobilizing resources, physical capital shown in green, labor accumulation, orange, and human capital accumulation, light orange. And TFP blue parts play a rather minor role in earlier decades. But now we see last 7-8 years, TFP growth accounted for, total factor productivity growth accounted for 40% of Asia's growth, the same as a contribution by physical capital stock accumulation. To endorse this, this book also shows Asia has been transforming itself from imitation-based growth to innovation-based growth recently. For example, according to the US Patent and Trademark Office data, among the foreign patent applicants to the US, top 5 used to be 1960, top 5 applicants and the granted patents, foreign patents, came from Germany, UK, France, Japan, Canada in 1960s. But latest data, 2015 data shows top 5 patent granted coming from Japan, Korea, Germany, Taipei, China, and PRC, People's Republic of China. So many data in the book we show Asia's major transformation from adapter of technology to innovator of technology. And this growth, structural transformation, technology-based growth has been supported by other key drivers listed here. I don't explain one by one, but the physical infrastructure and other capital accumulation, human capital accumulation, as well as open trade investment system supported by stable macroeconomic management. And also, more importantly, successful economies Asia rely on markets and private sector as engines of economic growth, while the state play a proactive role in addressing market failure and supporting the private sector. Critically, Asian countries adopted better policies and created stronger institutions for market-based growth. This market-oriented policy reform became the norm in Asia since 1970s. As we can see from this slide, roughly the period after World War II can be divided into 5 phases of different policy trend in Asia. In the past 50 years or on, in most developing Asia, development policies shifted from state-led industrialization to market-oriented growth. In some, half a century of Asian development shows sustained growth and poverty reduction require efficient markets, effective state, and strong institutions. Then a pandemic hit the economies around the globe and Asia. So I'd like to briefly touch upon our new report. The sudden emergence of COVID-19 really underscore importance of building disaster resilience. And this topic was not covered in Asia Journey to Prosperity book we published January last year. So 2 days ago, as I mentioned, we released this special supplement shown in the right part. I think the slide. I hope you see the slide. Probably there is some problem about showing my slide.
It did move.
It didn't move?
It did move just now.
Okay. Let me stop share and upload again. Yes, so this is a slide I was showing. So in addition to the main book left, we just released a disaster resilience special supplement report. So next couple of minutes, I'd like to briefly explain this special supplement. This special supplement is composed of 2 parts. First part is discussions of disaster in general. And the second part delves into how the region is navigating the ill effects of COVID-19 pandemic. Again, yes, yeah. So this is a composition of this special supplement. And yeah, I'm afraid the slide is very, very slowly moving, but indeed moving. The first part, talking about the broader disaster resilience, I'd like to point points rising trend of disaster risk globally and regionally. But since the 1960s, about 1/3 of all global disasters triggered by natural hazards has occurred in developing Asia. Generally speaking, a disaster occurs when a hazard interacts with the exposed and vulnerable population, causing a harm to people, damaging physical assets such as property, infrastructure, and incurring indirect losses from economic activity foregone. In developing Asia, exposure to disaster risk has risen over the last half century due to growing population, rapid urbanization, and economic growth. We may then say enhanced disaster risks another side of successful Asia's development performance. And then on the policy arena, approach to disaster management has evolved through the years. Especially, we can note that from 1994 to 2015, 3 important global frameworks for disaster risk management were adopted in high-level forum hosted by Japan. Recent major international agreements for development have also factored in disaster and climate risk in addressing broader development challenges. Despite progress in disaster risk management in Asia, more work needs to be done. And 1 minute or so, I'd like to briefly touch upon COVID-19. The second part of this special supplement discusses COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 has evolved in one of the most catastrophic events in human history, spreading to every continent in the world, including Asia. Number of cases continue to rise, both globally within developing Asia, including Indonesia. Pandemic is far from over. And ongoing pandemic affected economies through numerous channels listed here. Sharp decline in domestic demand, tourism, business travel, closure, exposure through trade and production linkages. Containment measure also undercuts supply side production activities. Seriously, COVID-19 crisis can generate long-term effects on vulnerable population, including a micro-enterprise, education, human capital accumulation, especially for children and women, labor-intensive service sectors, urban informal sector, propagating a chronic poverty and creating poverty traps. According to ADB estimates, crisis reversed years of progress towards eliminating poverty in developing Asia, as we see on the top. Long-term decline in poverty seems to be reversed. And last year, year 2020, due to COVID-19, additional 78 million people falling below the poverty line of $1.9 per day in developing Asia. Government responded swiftly and also with a massive scale. Since mid-April last year, ADB made and updated, has been updating COVID-19 policy database. This tracks large-scale policy packages of ADB's member countries. Within developing Asia, I'd like to point at two policy trends in last 1 year and a few months. First, policy packages worth more than 3.6, 3.7 trillion US dollars, more than 15% of regional GDP. These massive scale of policy packages has been announced and also started implementing to counteract effects of COVID-19. Secondly, government health and income support shown in the blue parts, light blue parts in this chart, accounted for more than half of the regions this massive policy response. And so this is the final slide. I'd like to mention Asian development gaps with advanced economies still remain large. Asian economies should maintain sound policies that prove to be worked and address remaining emerging challenges, such as listed here. First, overcoming health crisis and reopening economy. This is a top priority by adapting smartly and effectively rolling out vaccines, and also medium-term continue efforts to achieve a universal health coverage system. Second, innovate continuously. That's critical. COVID-19 really facilitated digitalization and rural platform economy developed quite rapidly. Can we catch up this trend in Asia? So that's the second challenge. Third one, as this Asia Journey to Prosperity book described in detail, last 5 decades, Asia adopted overall growth first and clean up later strategy. So Asia's growth and COVID-19 recovery needs to be greener and climate resilient and more inclusive, especially narrowing gender gaps. And number 4, school closure due to COVID-19. Quality and learning challenges in education became fiercer than before. So this is a particular area we need to place a policy priority. And number 5, 1.7 trillion US dollars annual physical infrastructure investment and broader social investment needed. So how to finance this large investment needs? Particularly mobilizing a private sector capital. That's really a big challenge. And finally, but not least, rapid aging, especially in East Asia, putting downward pressures on productivity growth in post-COVID-19 recovery. So how to tackle aging and demographic change? That's a big challenge. So with that, I'd like to stop my summary of Asia Journey to Prosperity book. And now I'd like to invite panelists to discuss, to make a discussion. So now, so first, I'd like to start by a big question. Before discussing about COVID-19, So Asia's development has been really phenomenal and remarkable. And my very first question I'd like to ask first Sua is this Asian development success unique? So this is a big question I'd like to ask, probably built on Indonesia's experience, especially mid-1980. Indonesia launched a program of broader trade and regulatory reforms. So, Sua, what do you think? Is Asia development experiences unique or it's not unique, which can be replicated to other countries? So, Sua, probably you can spend 8 minutes or so.
Okay. Thank you, Yasusan, and also a very good morning to everyone from Jakarta. I know that the participant of this seminar is worldwide, so wherever you are, I wish you all healthy and safe despite this pandemic. I also would like to congratulate the Asian Development Bank for publishing this piece, the Asia's journey to prosperity, along with the supplement on the disaster resilience. And personally, I would like to congratulate Nakao-san. I believe that you supervised this publication for a number of years while you are still the president of the ADB. So congratulations to you too. Yasu-san, thank you very much for the summary, and I think that resonates quite well to a number of experience that we see in Asia. The reliance on the structural transformation, the market reliance on market trades, and the very sharp increase on the total factor productivity. We believe I believe it's really because in Asia, we were able to maintain the macroeconomic stability and the human capital spending, human capital development is very focused. A lot of Asian economy focus a lot on the human capital development. Despite that, Yasusan, we also see the variations across economies in Asia regions. Of course, a lot of attention usually are taken from the East Asia and Southeast Asia. But Asia is quite diverse when you look into the South Asia and also the Asian part of the Middle East. It's quite diverse in that sense. So as I look at the publication, I look at the narratives that are developed there, I ask myself, what creates those variations? And I think a lot of the variation depends on it's actually can be described in terms of the how the economic transformations are related to the social and political structure of the economy. A lot happens in there. There are many variations. Yasusan, you are referring to Indonesia in the 1980s. We were under Suharto. The industrial transformation is very quick. We were blessed with the natural resources that we use a lot to boost our industrial transformation. But the social economic, the social political structure is lagging behind. Only later when we get into the 2000, we deal with the social political transformations as we see now in the last 20 years. And of course, that creates a big challenge on how to manage the economic transformation in the social political structure that are very specific to Indonesia. I believe a lot can be discussed when you talk about China, when you talk about Japan, if you talk about other economies, even the other thing like Singapore, that are very, very structured. And when you go to other countries in Asia, such as India, and I think it will be very, very interesting to look at if you ask Yasu in your last question, whether it can be replicated. It's a matter of we know the concept, we know the theory, we know the economic, we know the economic theory that needs to be applied, the social and political structure on how those economic transformation are going to be framed, very, very important for the question. I believe that I'm not suggesting another supplemental, Yasusan, but this is going to be very, very important to discuss and to analyze the relationship, how the political and social structure actually helps the economic transformation that are very well designed. Concentrate, focus on the human capital development, and then catch up with the innovation, from imitation to innovation, as you suggested earlier, and then rely on the market and trade, build the infrastructure, enough infrastructure, and maintain the microeconomic stability. I think those ingredients are, we know, everyone knows. The question is implementation in a certain political and social economic structure. I'll stop there, Yasu, to allow to hear other perspectives as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, to pointing not only common element of the Asian development, but also diversity is really the future of Asian development past few decades. And indeed, when we made this book, how to put the common element as well as the diversity, that was a big challenge when we edited this book. With that, let me continue the same question. Is Asia development unique? And now I'd like to ask Professor Basu, Kaushik, especially focusing on the role of institutions. If we take internationally comparable governance indicators or quality of institution, Asia usually has a relatively low scores on governance ratings. But at the same time, as we have seen in my presentation, development performance is quite outstanding. So this is somewhat sometimes seen as a paradox. And so how can you, what is your view on this? Asia's development unique with this peculiar institutional arrangement. And maybe also China and also other countries, quite different institutional setting. And China's performance has been really remarkable. And also other market-based economy and democratic economies are doing as well. So what's your view in terms of institution? Is Asia's development unique or not unique and can be replicated to other countries and regions? Over to you again, 8 minutes or so.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I should just tell you that this book actually has been sitting on my shelf right next to me, not just for today, but it's an excellent book. So congratulations to Yasu and to Takehiko Nakao for this wonderful book. I have not read your supplement, the second part to it, but I will get to that eventually. Yasu, let me step back a little bit, since you mentioned Gunnar Myrdal, which is roughly 50 years, and which is what we are talking about now. It is amazing. People very often forget that the subtitle of Myrdal's book, Asian Drama, was an inquiry into the poverty of nations. That is just a reminder of how Asia was viewed, that an inquiry into the poverty of nations, this is just 1968. Asia changed dramatically after that. Not all countries, but within Asia, there are some countries which are completely like advanced economies anywhere in the world. There are some countries which are very poor. There are some countries with conflict, but overall, there's a whole host of countries in Asia that showed a growth spurt of a kind that we had not seen anywhere in the world. There were the Asian tigers, the four of them that we typically talk about. But even before that, Japan, it had happened. China came a little bit later, from 1980 or so. China begins its spurt. India begins its spurt from about 1993, 94. It begins a growth spurt. And really, the Asian picture is totally different now. One more piece of just history. I remember in 1980s, mid-1980s, I was visiting United States. I was visiting Princeton as a visiting professor from India. And Japan was on the verge of overtaking United States in terms of per capita income, something people couldn't have imagined 20 years earlier. It did not happen. US again went in for another growth spurt, but the fact that there are Asian countries right on the forefront is something novel. The question that you're asking is indeed true, that the Asian model is not typically treated as giving a lot of space to institutions, etc. It is very often viewed as almost a top-down growth. And here, China is a very good example. China is a country that has grown phenomenally. From about 1980s, a little after 1980s, it begins a growth spurt, growing roughly at 9-10% per annum for 30 years. It's an unseen, very few countries in the past have done that. But my own view on China, expectation here onwards, is people very often talk about the middle income trap. But I'm going to create another term for China and a few other countries. Middle income K crossroads, like the letter K. China is at a juncture where it could really take off, the top branch of K, or it could begin to stall, and I'll come just now. Economies which are top-down economies. We have, history has seen both examples. There are examples of top-down economies which really went in for the top branch of K, took off. Singapore is the best example of that. Very top-down, people were saying this can't work, but it worked. But there are many other examples of countries where the institutions don't get enough space and the countries do badly. We can go back long into history. Argentina, 100 years ago, was expected to overtake United States, and it was very close to that. But that did not happen. It went on to the lower branch of K. China stands at that kind of a juncture. It could go for a real spurt. It could slow down because it is top down. And let me explain a little bit the risks, and this is for China to deal with it. There is an analogy from music. This is the British music composer, Charles Hazelwood, music conductor Charles Hazelwood made a fantastic observation about orchestras. He said, if you have an orchestra which is fully controlled by the conductor, everyone does exactly what the conductor does, that orchestra will be very good. But if you want true excellence of the orchestra, you need freedom and space for individual musicians. And he is speaking as a conductor, that if you can create that space so that individuals are innovating in small ways, not being completely obedient from the order top down, but a part of the game. And at one level, institutions are a bit like that kind of space, which can give a country the power to move ahead and surge ahead. There's also the importance, and we will come back to this when we get into COVID. I feel creativity is going to be the key next round. Creativity and innovation that you were talking about just now. The next round of frontrunners will be countries that can innovate and are creative. And I feel one example, if I may point out, South Korea is one of the world's best examples of huge emphasis on education, intellectual productivity, and it really takes off as an economy. And I think the stress on education in South Korea has played a major role. There are other countries standing at different stages. I actually am personally very optimistic about Indonesia. One reason being, Indonesia has handled The COVID crisis, I know, it is right in the middle of a wave right now, so very difficult situation. It has handled that very well, but those are matters that I will come back to later. Let me stop at this point, and then as we get into other topics, I'm going to come back again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaushik. Indeed, very, very stimulating discussion, and probably social plan with institution which can facilitate innovation or business and grassroots level. That arrangement may be one key element behind the Asia's success. So now I'd like to hand over microphone to Chatib. Chatib, you were finance minister after a couple of years after the global financial crisis. And so I think lots of reform efforts triggered by crisis and maybe broadly speaking disaster. So with that view and your broader observation of Asian development, again, how do you assess Asian development? Is it unique, or is it contains a lot of a common element which can be generalizable for other latecomers to develop? So Chatib, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yasu. First of all, I would like to echo other speakers to congratulate for this excellent book for President Nakao and also Sawada-san. Yeah. To respond to your questions, I think there are three elements which are very important in the success story of the Asian countries. Yeah. The first one is industrialization. The second one is trade. And the third one is macroeconomic stability. Yeah, I do believe that if you look at the success story on many East Asian countries, yeah, including Southeast Asia, are basically depend on those three components and elements. Yeah, but interestingly, the way the Asian countries promote the industrialization and trade are very. So the key words for this is pragmatism in policy. Yeah, it's hard for me to classify the Asian model is unique or not. If you want to say that the unique, I want to say is about this pragmatism. Yeah. Look at Singapore, for example. Singapore is always considered as a country with the free market. But interestingly, the GIC, the government, link, the companies, yeah, is very dominant in Singapore through the state-owned enterprise. So how do you explain this in the capitalist system that you have a huge state-owned enterprise, the role of the state-owned enterprise? Look at China, a very similar situation. And now let me talk about Indonesia, about this, pragmatism. In the 70s, if you look at the strategy of Indonesia in terms of this industrialization, we adopted the so-called import substitution. And the reason behind it is because we had money from the oil boom. Yeah. On the 80s, when the oil price collapsed, then the government could not afford to continue with the import substitution anymore because we don't have money. Then the government launched the economic deregulation. Yeah, the same policymaker. So you can see, the approach is very pragmatic. When you have money, then you introduce sort of like in industrialization a model, like by adopting the import substitution. But when you don't have money, then you let the market to work. So I can see, this model, yeah, is quite similar in many countries in Asia about this pragmatism. I wouldn't say that, the approach of Asian economists, the growth of Asia, our quote unquote, the Asian model is very different from the so-called the Washington consensus. In many issues, there are some similarities, macro stability, some economic deregulation. But on the other hand, you can see that the role of state is also there through the development of infrastructure, especially related to the providing the basic needs, yeah, the role of the fiscal policy in providing the basic needs. So to answer your question whether this is unique or not is probably the answer is yes and no, in the sense that focusing on the trade in industrialization. But one thing that makes Asia probably different with some countries in Latin America of this success story of the growth is about pragmatism. Yeah, I don't see that ideology is really one factor that driving the economic policy. Yeah, and then this is common in many countries. If you let's say if you talk about Korea, is focusing on the ultra export promotion, but there are some elements of the government intervention there. Yeah, through also driven by industrial policy. I is too early to conclude like that because in the case of Indonesia, say, picking winner did not work. It's always bad in picking winners, but losers are very good in picking government, and that's the reality. There's yeah, the government intervention by providing sort of like. So probably my answer is not quite straightforward. The elements are quite common, but the way the Asian countries implement their policies is really based on the practice. So, I'd like to, to share with you when I was in also, we policy mostly because of the pragmatism and also the constraint that we have to face to involve in the policy. We are not living in the first best world. We're living in the second best world, and unfortunately, quite often run by the third best bureaucracy, and we have to live with it. Yeah. So pragmatism, the key, the keywords for Asian growth model. So I think I'll leave it up here. Over to you, Yasu. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for many important messages. Pragmatism as a common core element. And also, I thought personally, scarcity made by a crisis leading to market-oriented reform and small government inevitably. I think that pattern we observe in Asia. That's also a very important observation, I think. Okay, now I'd like to turn over the microphone to Nakao-san, who is actually de facto leader or chief editor of this Asian Journey to Prosperity book. And again, I'd like to postulate the same question, whether Asian development can be considered as a unique or generalizable. And especially as we already discussed, comparison between market orientation versus central planning, we see a different kind of mixture in Asia in different economy. But what is your view on this Asian's development uniqueness? So please, Nakao-san.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate the work of the people who prepared this meeting, and it's a great honor to me to be with the distinguished panelists. First, I'd like to say why I really wanted to publish this book. And after we published the book about the ADB history itself in 2016, we started the preparation of this very seriously. And the reason is because we want to record what the ADB achieved and also how ADB developed in two separate books. And the reason is because we can learn a lot from history. In any country, we should learn history. But my observation is that the Asian histories, especially in the English publication, are often by the Western scholars, Europeans or Americans, by English. But I think we can explain our own histories of development by Asian voices in English. And there are many good PhD economists in ADB, and we also have many peoples in the different expertise, including gender, climate change, infrastructures, and so on. So I wanted to write a book which is based on the true kind of voices of Asia with a diversity and also very interesting narrative about why the health, the average life expectancy became from 45 to 72 because of the help to delivery of children and the clean waters and of course, nutrition and vaccinations and antibiotics. So we want to make a narrative about things. When and where the electricity was first produced in Asia, in India, in Kyoto, and so on. So I want to make this book interesting to read, and we can reflect on histories of different countries. So that is the first comment I want to make, and especially I want to, in a sense, correct the kind of I wouldn't say prejudice, but the stereotypes of the Western scholars often about Asia. So Asia is more state-guided, there are more industrial policies, targeted industrial policies, and export-oriented growth. About the state guidance or not, as already Professor Basu and Mr. Basri mentioned, although, of course, state was important to kind of prepare the institutions and support some kind of work of a private sector, but it is also true that the private sector is, after all, the engine of growth in any country. So when Japan modernized in 19th century, the railway was built by merchants, and it was by the concessions of the government, but they were first built by the merchants and farmers who wanted to transport silk from inland to the port areas. So it was a kind of ethos of capitalists or the peoples in the private sectors who did it. So the same is true to Asian success, and the Asia started to grow very fast after the state intervention in the economy, influenced by the socialist ideas or anti-colonization's idea or center-peripheral ideas. When they were over, they started using private sectors based on trade and FDI and so on more seriously, and that's why Asia could develop. So, of course, there are countries like Singapore, for instance, and there was a more state guidance, but Singapore is, I would say, small city-state, and it is better to see it more like an investment bank of big investment bank guided by the meritocracy, very capable people, and with a lot of ideas and planning and learning from abroad. So it has been very successful, but many Asian countries are bigger and they are basically more private sector led, and I really want to emphasize it. And if we say that whether there are many diversities in Asia, but if we say that, it is also true that the European countries and America have a different approaches, different models. Spain and Sweden is totally different. America is different from France. France has still more state-owned companies, so it's more state-guided. So it's very strange that to say that Asia is more state-guided compared to the Western standard approach, because Western is not the same also. So in short, as Mr. Basri said, Asian growth is more based on standard economics, although it is more practical and gradual, and the institutions were set by the government, but there is no such thing like Asian consensus, or of course Beijing consensus. And the reasons of Asia's success was more based on standard approach of the Washington consensus, macro stability, privatizations of private sectors, trade and so on. And especially trade was important because after all, the human society's economic growth was based on the market economy, price signals, and division works and trade, and so on. And trade is becoming more wider because of containerizations and also the logistics and internet information sharing. So, of course, these are important, but it was not necessarily export-oriented. Japan was often said export-oriented. Japan suffered the current account deficit until 1960s. So the reasons that Japan wanted to export was to import resources and technologies and capital goods and so on. So it was not for exporting and getting current account surplus. So that is another important point. Outward looking policies. And then about technologies, I was so, in a sense, embarrassed by the idea of Mr. Krugman when I first had his view in 1990s, and I was in Washington, worked for the IMF, and his discussion is Asian growth is more like Soviet by mobilizing labor and capital. But combining labor and capital in a very efficient way and mobilize those things, especially domestically, is already achievement, which other regions like Africa was not necessarily successful. So mobilizing resources of capital and labor in a very good way, and especially human capital, is also a part of the growth reasons. It was already great achievement, and it's not by state-guided planning, state planning for mobilizing capital and labor, but it was more by market. And when it reaches a certain level, they naturally started having more total factor productivities, and also some technologies are already incorporated in better capital investment, capital quality. So even if it's not the TFC, total factor productivity, the technology elements are already in the human capital part and also capital part. So I wanted to emphasize the importance of technology. That's why we devoted one discussion for technologies, including the online and so on. So those are things I really want to say. And from now on, of course, we must continue to have a private sector-led growth with their good institutions. And I hope that China also will continue to prioritize, emphasize the importance of freedom of thinking and freedom of researches and so on. So it will, in the end, promote more innovations. And that's what China has been doing since 1978. That is, let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Nakao-san. Very comprehensively covering main message of this book. And listening to your intervention, I thought that this book may be used as a subtext book for microeconomics to see how markets works in reality and how government intervention can correct the market failure. So thank you.
Main textbook for economic history and the sub textbook for microeconomics.
Thank you very much. And so there are a few comments already placed in chat box. So I think one relevant question in the context of our current discussion, I think comment from Faris Abdullah saying that Asian tigers, this is about government-private collaboration or relationship. Asian tigers' success could not be divorced from successful instances of government-private collaboration. For example, SEZ in the case of China, export discipline in the case of let me see. Sorry. In the case of South Korea and Taipei, China. Can this same strategy that delivered development for East Asian countries be imitated by middle-income countries at the middle-income crossroads, such as Indonesia? So I think this is a big question, but very important question to ask. So I'd like to invite Sua to respond if you have some thoughts about this, replicability of East Asians governments private sector collaboration. So Sua,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you, Yasusan. I think if we look at the Indonesian experience, the very early case of how the government and the private sector are linked, more like not very healthy one. It is based on the concession. It is based on the relationship that are privileges and so on. In fact, only later that we come to the understanding that the public-private partnership can be more than just the concession or the privileges. It can be governed. The public-private partnership can be governed. And right now, the governance on the public-private relationship, I think, we learn a lot from other countries, other perspectives. We also not only limiting the public-private partnerships on the regional development, but also on the infrastructure development and so on. And on the public-private partnership, sometimes the first mindset that come into play is that the public is directly the budget. So budget that are directly used by the private. Of course, we know that the later models also includes the state-owned enterprise, also includes different regulations that are put the governance at the core of the relationships. On the state-owned enterprise, for example, I think the emphasis should be put on the enterprise rather than on the state-owned. So it's a different kind of relationship if we see that the state-owned enterprise in China, state-owned enterprise even in the Middle East and other places in the world, also in Indonesia. Indonesia is undergoing a very important restructurization of our state-owned enterprise so that we can put more emphasis on the enterprises rather than on the state. So it's going to be a model that are very specific to the countries, and then related to the question about the special economic zones on the export oriented. There are also questions about whether we going to continue with the export. It's a very big question. This COVID told us that in the last year and a half, almost the world is relying on local. The export and import are ceased to operate. So that bring a very big question on what kind of export that we should do. Of course, we understand the role of export in the export promotion, but at the same time, we also have to look at the internal capacity, the domestic market. And for a country as big as Indonesia, it is going to be very, very important to make sure that we understand the importance of the domestic market, the domestic supply in relation with the export. I stop there, Yasu, and it's going to be a very big question that may need a long time to address. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Suha. So countries like Indonesia and other middle-income countries built on the past success now standing at the middle-income crossroads. So how country can continue the development, from now on, in spite of COVID-19? That's a big challenge. So now I'd like to switch a gear a little bit, and there are some questions in the chat box. Strong solidarity among the Asian countries. Do the Asian leaders really share the same vision? And also, I think another question, pandemic has shown government works better than the private, particularly in health sector in India. So I think now I'd like to switch a gear to talking about the pandemic and facing still ongoing pandemic and the recurrence of waves and the vaccine rollout challenges. So there has been worries, long-term consequences of the pandemic. I briefly mentioned long-run scars left by a pandemic. So I'd like to ask this question. What is your view on long-term fundamental negative impacts for Asians' phenomenal growth? Has the pandemic really changed the long-term trajectory, successful development trajectory of Asia's development permanently? And also, pandemic really triggered the change in middle income K-cross roads and pushing down many countries to downside trajectory. So this is again open question, and there are lots of uncertainty. But I'd like to really appreciate Professor Basu, Kaushik, your view on long-term impact of a pandemic. And then I'd like to ask same question to Chatib and Nakao-san. How pandemic change or not change the trajectory of Asia's development? So Kaushik,
yes, very happily. Well, it's not a happy topic, but I will take this on. The pandemic is actually creating a challenge for the world and for Asia. It has been pointed out repeatedly that the pandemic is going to have unusual recovery. Some countries recovering well, some doing very badly. And Asia is a good domain where we are seeing two kinds of countries and a whole lot of very successful ones. People are talking about Vietnam. There are, I think, 3 countries where the GDP has already recovered to pre-pandemic level. China, Vietnam, Bangladesh. For these 3, for sure, there may be a few others because all of them dipped and then picked up, and these 3 countries have done very well. Now, where are we going to end up? What is the prospect out of this? You can never be sure. Economics is a complex discipline, but this is what I expect is going to happen out of this pandemic. It's the pandemic combined with the technological advance that was taking place, say, over the last 30 years. Demand for labor was dropping. So that was forcing us to be more innovative, to think of new ways of employing labor because artificial intelligence is coming in, digital technology is coming in, a lot of routine labor, the demand is going down. I feel the COVID is going to hasten this process massively. For one, this is in the old-fashioned economics, we used to talk about learning by doing. The best way to learn something is to be forced to do. I was never so comfortable doing Zoom lectures, Zoom classes, sessions as I am now, even 9 months ago. This has been learning by doing. So I feel the rise of digital technology, which was already causing strains in the world, is going to cause strains, but it's strain with hope. And the reason for hope is what the rise of technology and the COVID having hastened is going to do is mechanical work is going to be taken over by machines, by artificial intelligence, by robotics. But that does not mean that society is going to flounder. There is space for creative work, which is huge. And my own belief is the global GDP growth, starting not immediately, but maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road, is going to be much faster than what it was earlier. Most people say that the environment will not tolerate very high GDP growth. They say that because they associate GDP growth with more cars, more houses, more yachts. But we know that GDP is anything that human beings value. So my expectation is the GDP growth of the future is going to be better health. Better health is a very important component of GDP. Greater life expectancy, greater consumption of music, arts, and all kinds of things. So GDP will grow, but the components of GDP will change. Labor will be used, but the kind of labor is going to be very, very different than the kind of labor that the workers will be involved in. That's because the creative work is going to be done by us, and the dull work is going to be taken over by robotics and digital technology. Which means, once again, it's going to be very important what we do with education, how creative we make education. And there are countries, which is very interesting. I was recently looking at, there are several Asian countries which have been aware of the importance of education, outbound education, where people go elsewhere, come back. And as you were pointing out, that today, in terms of patenting of intellectual property, the countries in the lead in the world are in Asia. Japan and South Korea are prominent in intellectual creation of intellectual property. Countries that have been having the policy of outbound students, sending students out for them to learn and then to come back. In fact, there's a recent study, which is the last 17 years of outbound students. Initially, India was in the lead. India would send the highest percentage of students going outside for higher studies and coming back. Coming back or not is up to them, but being sent out. China overtook India some time ago. And most recently, Vietnam has overtaken China. Of course, percentage of population in outbound students, and they've got this project called 911 project, which is state funding to send PhD students abroad, which is investment in creative activity. So I feel this is going to play a very major role. Yasu, if I may point to something that came up earlier, I also feel, I'm going back, that the public-private partnership is going to be important, very important. Economics does not anymore believe that it's only the state that will do it or only the market that will do it. But we have to remember that in PPP, the two P's are very different, the public and the private. So it is possible to do a wrong mixture where you bring them together and you mess it up, because these are like putting two very different animals inside the same cage. So the fine print of the regulation, how you're combining different parts, is important. And one tribute, not in this, which I'll give to Indonesia. Indonesia has played actually a major role in the handling of the COVID. It has done the blending of taking care of the health sector and the economy, lockdown in stops and starts and curated lockdown very well. And there is a part of the credit does go to the president of Indonesia, and the formation of these partnerships like the COVID-19 handling and National Economic Recovery Committee, which is the economics and health being handled together so that the lockdown is being done, keeping in mind that it's going to affect the economy. So it's these combinations which will play a major role, and we have to watch and see in this transformed world who comes out on top, who does not. Let me stop with that.
Thank you very much, Kaushik. Indeed, many important points. PPP, or public-private. Actually, in the book we mentioned some countries, some instances, industrial policy was successful when the policy intervention was market-based and performance-based, as well as with a clear rules and guidelines and sunset action. Then it seems to work. So I think a really subtle, nuanced relationship is needed to support economic development. And also, thank you for pointing out the importance, post-COVID-19, importance of well-being or wellness of population in addition to GDP. I think that's a very important point. And indeed, last year, we released Asian Development Outlook, a theme chapter focusing on wellness of Asian population. And one figure we put out was wellness industry was already big in Asia, 10% of GDP, broadly speaking, supporting economic development. So I think the importance of this broader welfare will be also critical in supporting continued economic development. Thank you very much. So now, Chatib, I'd like to invite you for the same question, whether COVID-19 it's gonna leave long-term scar to the economy and development of Asia or Indonesia or other Asian economies. Any thoughts?
Thank you, Yasu. This is really a big question, actually, because there is one variable that we don't know the answer yet. Yeah, how long this pandemic will last. And I think this is very important because I do believe that the basic assumption about this economic recovery will depend so much on the ability to address the pandemic. Yeah. So if you look at from the economic recovery in China, for example, or Vietnam, it was driven by the ability of the government to address the pandemic. This variable is unknown until today because we never know that how long this pandemic will will stay with us, or probably to become the endemic. But this is really assumption for the economic recovery. But besides all this, there are variables that we don't have the answer. If this pandemic will stay with us for quite some time, yeah, then there are some concern about the impact, the long-lasting impact to the economy. The first one is my biggest concern is the risk of the so-called the K-shaped recovery. Yeah, because the one who can survive from this crisis is probably the fortunate one who does have enough savings, resources, yeah, but maybe not for the unfortunate one. So I gave an example. If the government introduced lockdown, yeah, unfortunately, lockdown policy is biased in favor towards middle and upper income group, unless the government could provide the social assistance. So that is why a country like India, like Indonesia, is not always easy to introduce this lockdown policy because the social resources that we need. Yeah. So the risk of the inequality is there. So this is one thing that we probably need to anticipate, after the, economic recovery in the future. That's the first one. The second one, Kaushik mentioned about the importance of the digital technology. I completely agree with him that, one thing that we learned from this economic crisis is the one who can transform themselves into the digital technology can survive. But unfortunately, I have to say that there is an issue about digital divide here. Yeah. Why digital divide? Because the infrastructure, digital infrastructure, is not equally available for many countries in the world, or even a country like Indonesia. Some part of Indonesia, we are still you know, have a problem with the digital divide. The other thing that's also very important is also about this vaccine inequality, because as I mentioned to you, one of the assumption is we can only address the issue of this economic provided that we can address the issue of this pandemic. But the problem is related to that. Not all of the emerging economies or developing countries have an access for the vaccine. Yeah. So this is really the key issue that we have to look at. The other issue is about the impact of the human capital as well, because students, for over a year, they have to stay at home and learning from home, right? And then this will have an impact about the quality of education in the future as well. Workers, they have to stay at home. So probably there are some need to do the training, retraining, upscaling. Yeah. This is the thing that probably we need to anticipate in the future, that probably the outcome, the result of the recovery, will be very challenging and will change the trajectory. So there is a risk of the issue of the middle income trap. But let me conclude by saying that hope as well. First, I agree with about this digital transformation. The technology will help us to drive the. The second one is we are era of the interest rate for quite some time, and we can use this opportunity for the so-called the green recovery, because the investment costs for the environmental friendly sectors will be relatively cheap. Yeah. So let me quote what Winston Churchill said, that uh, don't let the crisis go to waste. Yeah. Take the opportunity for doing this. Take this from this crisis to come up with more. Uh, more. Uh, I would say that, like using for the green recovery. The second one, we probably need to build in the future for better investment in the public health, on education, on addressing the issue of inequality. So with